Gentlemen, welcome to this IEA Taxpayers Alliance event. We are going to be discussing socialism, future. You haven't quite got the hang of this yet, have you? Future or failure? Now, this is going to be a little bit different to a traditional balloon debate. As I understand the balloon debate, one person gets voted out, and then you go on, and then another person is going. We're not doing it that way. Each of our, I was going to say contestants, it is a little bit like that, isn't it? Each of our guests here are going to speak for 2 minutes, then you're going to have your say, and then they're going to sum up for 1 minute, and then you vote as to who should remain in the balloon, which will obviously be me, because I haven't spoken. We will be finishing at 6:45 on the dot, because 15 minutes later I have a radio show to present, so that's a bit of an impetus to finish on time. So, let me introduce the panel. On the far end, Scott Simmons is a researcher for the Taxpayers Alliance. Dr. Christian Niemitz, Head of Political Economy at the Institute of Economic Affairs. The invisible man is Dan Hodges from the Mail on Sunday, but he will be arriving, I'm assured. You don't need any introduction to Julia Hartley-Brewer. Ex of LBC. Ex of LBC, now Talk Radio. And next to her is Dan Hannan, MEP. And next to her, and I want you to give an incredibly polite, conservative welcome to Dawn Foster from The Guardian. So, Scott, you're going to lead us off. 2 minutes. I'm going to time you, so I will cut you off at 2 minutes.
Okay, is the microphone on? Yeah, there we go. Yes, not surprising. Socialism for failure, obviously. You don't really have to look around the world or throughout history too far to see that. Like contemporary-wise, Venezuela, throughout history, the Soviet Union. But I think you can argue all that, but I think the failure is actually baked into socialism itself. Because it comes down to who's actually doing the spending. Capitalism focuses on the public and the people to be the driver of economic growth and the economy, rather than socialism that relies on state funding and the state to push that economic growth. And I suppose you need to quote Milton Friedman if people don't know the 4 types of spending. But if you're buying a product for yourself...
Can you hold the microphone further to your mouth?
Is it
much
okay,
better?
There we go. Ah, sorry. Oh, jeez. Hello.
I know these things.
Yes. Sorry. Yes, so if you're buying a product for yourself, you're looking for value for money, and also the price is a good price. If you're spending someone else's money on yourself, you're going to have a good time, but it's also quality driven. If you're spending your money on something for someone else, a product or a service, it's price driven and quality to an extent, but not the main driver. And the 4th type of spending is when you're spending someone else's money on someone else, and that's basically the government. And I think if you look at good and bad spending, I think government has a very, very bad track record of spending rather than capitalist market-driven economics. So that's my take on socialism. It's baked in as a bad idea.
And spoken to time as well. Well done. Round of applause. If you do want to stand up so everybody can see you, that would be good as well. And don't forget, do hold the microphone close to your mouth. Christian.
Thank you, Ian. Well, there can be no doubt that socialism has become very popular again, especially with the millennial generation. That is true. That's well documented. There's lots of surveys and focus group studies on that. It's more than just a social media fluke. It is happening. But what has happened is a rebranding of socialism rather than a reinvention. It's not that somebody has come up with a brilliant new theory on socialism. It's just that the old socialist theories have been repackaged. When I get off the train, I often see a bloke from the Socialist Workers' Party who is trying to sell their paper, The Socialist Worker. He's a scruffy, bearded bloke, greasy hair, doesn't look very trust-inspiring. And for quite a while, people like him were the public face of socialism. If you had asked random members of the public 5 years ago to describe their idea of a stereotypical socialist, I think most people would have described someone quite like him. Today, if you ask the same question, you're going to get a very different answer. Today, people would be much more likely to describe a trendy hipster sitting in a craft beer pub, and that's essentially what millennial socialism is. It's the hipsterization of socialism. Socialism has become hip and trendy, but there hasn't been a change in the substance. If you put the socialist worker salesman and the trendy millennial socialist on a panel and you try to work out what exactly they disagree on, you would struggle. There has been, this year, there has been a flurry of books from people who try to have reinvented socialism in one form or another, with titles like Fully Automated Luxury Communism, the People's Republic of Walmart, the Socialist Manifesto. I've read some of those books. What they all have in common is, on the one hand, they're very keen to distance themselves from earlier versions of socialism. They're all very keen to say it's not going to be anything like that, like any of those failed models.
Time's up.
But okay.
Sorry.
But the trouble is, they can't say what they would do differently.
Julia Harley-Brewer.
Thank you very much. You have to excuse me for having some notes and some glasses on because it's been a very long day already since getting up at 4 o'clock, so apologies for that. I'm going to make the practical case against socialism because the scariest thing, as you've just made a point of, is how popular socialism is. 40% of Brits have a favourable view of socialism now, and this is telling because 0% of Brits have ever lived under socialism. Socialism has a much better reputation than it deserves. It's got the image of being all caring and sharing and kind and cuddly, when in fact it's a peculiarly nasty ideology. It is, I like to think, as a former guinea pig owner myself, the cuddly guinea pig of economic systems, when in fact it's just a rat with good PR. Don't use up my 2 minutes. Right, now the main problem with socialism is that socialism in practice is very, very different from socialism in theory. In theory, it's about sharing out the proceeds of wealth and ensuring that the poorest are looked after, which sounds great. I was raised in a left-wing household. This sounds great to me. In practice, it's about the state enforcing the removal of wealth and property from people and taking away their property. In practice, it's the Soviet Union, it's Mao's China, it's Tito's Yugoslavia, it's Vietnam, it's Cambodia, it's Cuba, it's North Korea, and yes, of course, it's Venezuela. Now, what's so interesting, I think, about socialism and what makes it so different to welfare capitalism, to social democracy, things which I very much support, and obviously economic systems which exist very successfully around the world, is that when people in a free and fair election, remember those, when people who actually live under those systems of welfare capitalism or social democracy get an opportunity to vote for those economic systems, they do so again, which tells us something, because people who live under socialism never vote to continue to live under socialism in free and fair elections, mainly because they don't get the chance. Why don't they get the chance? Because they'd vote the wrong way. Remember that. No one who's lived under socialism wants to live under socialism unless they're the people who are benefiting from socialism, who are the tiny elite, who don't. Just to say, the proof is in the pudding.
Dan Hannan.
How extraordinary that we're even talking about this. In the crude mathematics of murder, there is no more lethal idea than revolutionary socialism. The mid-Atlantic slave trade killed maybe 10 million people. The Nazis killed maybe 17 million. Communism, which is the logical form of socialism, taken to its extreme, killed 100 million people. Some shot into pits, some starved as deliberate state policy. Every time, Albania to Angola, Benin to Bulgaria, Cuba to Czechoslovakia, every time it ends the same way. With grime and poverty, with the arrest of opposition leaders, with gulags, and with firing squads. And yet, we are still talking about whether somehow it's a good idea, about somehow whether it's just been badly implemented, but nonetheless, the kind of platonic, ideal form of socialism ought to be separately judged. Let me just say one thing. We cannot give socialism uniquely a free pass. We cannot judge every other system in the world by its necessarily imperfect real-world examples, but maintain that socialism has never properly been tried. Just imagine using that line of argument with any other ideology. Just imagine if somebody were to stand up on this panel and say, well, you know, you shouldn't judge fascism by those 1930s regimes that called themselves fascist. Your fascism has never been tried. That would, of course, be a ludicrous proposition because we all understand that the animating spirit of coercion, of forcing people to do what is not in their interests and what is not in their inclination, ends up with firing squads and with imprisonment. One last thought. People will sometimes say, well, the trouble with the free market is it makes people greedier. It makes them more materialistic. It means that they don't value things like friends and family and so on. There is no more moral system than the market. Human nature is not created by political systems. If by greed you mean the desire for physical things, that's in our DNA, or if you prefer, it's original sin.
Time's up.
But the one way that you can fulfill your greed, if you like, under the capitalist system is by offering a service to the people around you rather than sucking up to those in power. And that's what makes our system morally superior as well as economically more efficient.
I'm tempted to say that Dawn should have about 8 minutes here to provide a bit of balance. So I might be a little bit loose on the timekeeping here. Dawn Foster.
I speak a lot in public, and this is probably the toughest crowd I've come across. So I have to say, the reason that socialism is becoming so popular is simply because for so many people, capitalism isn't working. And so many young people, after the crash, realize after the crash that their wages have not kept pace with inflation. So the housing crisis is due to capitalism. The fact that they are not paid enough is due to capitalism. And over again, young people think there must be a better system. And redistribution of wealth is a great idea. I mean, I'm sure that I'm speaking to the wrong crowd, but there are too many people who earn too much money. There really, really are. I'm sorry. If you get to the point where you own multiple properties when other people are homeless, some people have too much money and other people have not enough. And the only reason why socialism is gaining so much traction at the moment is because we want a different system. If you look at America, the health system there is appalling. It's absolutely appalling. You have debt collectors coming around because your child has cancer. We have a socialized system of medicine that was brought in under socialism, and that's why we're all here today. That's why we haven't died of polio. That's why we haven't died of tonsillitis. And over again, people realise that post-crash especially, nothing is working for so many people. It would be great if the government didn't have to subsidise so many ultra-wealthy companies like Tesco who are paying poverty wages and the government are picking up the bill for their rent. It would be much better if instead we redistributed the wealth.
2 minutes on the clock, respect. Or Dawn wins the timekeeping. Now, have we got a microphone for the audience? Do you want to have two? Right, I'm going to restrict audience contributions to a maximum of 1 minute each, but if you can sort of make them a little bit shorter, so much the better. Sir, say who you are and where you're from.
Thank you very much. I'm from Brighton, Kent Town. The climate crisis is a massive issue, and that's generally due to perhaps overpopulation. As socialism ends up in the death of a lot of people, could it be the perfect solution?
Pithy and to the point, I would say, there. Right, you wanted to have a go?
Thank you very much. Tom Packer, I suppose, is Tory Conference, Old Southwark and Bermondsey Conservative Association. It's probably the relevant hat. I worry greatly about the ways where regulations cause a great deal of socialist damage without being seen to be socialism. Like, I personally think the housing crisis is a classic example. Other countries with a less regulated housing market have cheaper housing, for example, Germany. But because it's so tightly controlled, people very understandably blame the market system. And I worry that we seem to keep having extra regulation without repealing it. And then that's the problems that causes get concealed, so people look for a more radical Corbynite solution. How do we stop this slow tick-tock of more and more regulation, particularly, but not exclusively, in ways that affect the cost of living, like green levies for energy, like regulating housing for housing prices, and stop people going around for this radical solution that's failed before?
Right, let's move. Gentleman there. Women, feel free to ask questions as well.
David Roberts, Meal Rally Conservatives. Do you think that millennials tend to support socialism more than the older generation?
Closer to your mouth, thank you.
Do you think that millennials tend to support socialism more than the older generation because they didn't live through the chaos of the 70s under Labour, and they don't have an idea of what it's actually like? They just have the shiny version, if you like.
Right. Who's the next? Right, where? I can't see.
There.
Right, one there, and then somebody here.
The blonde one, blue there.
Right.
Okay, I'm a lady.
I don't think you're allowed to say that anymore.
Oh, sorry. No, you said that the distribution of wealth should be improved upon. But if we do distribute our wealth, not that I'm very wealthy, but if we did, they just take it and do nothing for it. And I think that's where socialism is wrong, that they have to earn what they deserve.
Right.
I was just about to say exactly the same thing.
Use the microphone properly, please. No, it's on. Just put it to your
I was-
mouth. God,
Sorry.
how many more times do I have to say it?
I'm scared. No, I was going to say something very similar to that. It's all very well calling for redistribution of wealth, but what happens when, say, you take all the wealth in the country, you split it equally, some people will do something with it, some people will just leave it in the ground, and some people will just spend it at the bookies or in the pub or whatever. I know that's simplistic, but I think that's what happens, and I think it's true. Socialism, I used to be a socialist. I really did. I grew up in a very
But you're
left-wing...
all right now.
But I think you're being quite mean to me, Ian. I feel bullied. Maybe I should go back to being a socialist. No, but seriously, and I understand all this. I understand why people like the idea of socialism. I'm a teacher, and I talk to sixth form, etc., etc. I don't. Okay, so I'd just like to know, Dawn, okay, what happens the day after you redistribute all the wealth?
Okay, well, let's have a round. Where's the other microphone? No, I've given it some. Can you give the microphone to Dawn first? Or somebody else if you prefer not to.
No, it's fine.
So if you go to Dawn, and then if anybody else wants to chip in as well.
So on climate, I don't think that overpopulation is a problem. I think that's quite a racist idea. No, I'm not calling you racist. I'm saying that it is an idea that has a lot of traction with some racist people. I think.
She's calling you a racist.
I think the big problem with climate is the fact that a huge number of multinationals pollute the environment, and they need to stop. And so I think that is a problem of capitalism. I don't think it's a problem of overpopulation. I've forgotten the question over
Redistribution.
there. Oh yeah, redistribution. I think I've worked a lot of jobs, and I think that when I worked in a cafe and when I worked in Asda, I probably worked a lot harder than I do as a journalist, but I'm paid a lot more now. And I think that we often undervalue low-paid jobs, and we overvalue high-paid jobs. And a huge number of people I know are paid a lot of money for working a lot less hard than people who are on minimum wage. And that's why I think redistribution works. And on whether or not they spend it at the bookies, if they spend it at the bookies, they will. You can't stop that from happening. But I think that everybody deserves to be given a fair wage and enough money to earn an equal standard of living. If they spend it, if they spend it at the bookies, they can't afford the food, and they suffer the consequences of that.
But you won't allow them. You won't allow them to suffer the consequences of that, will you? That's the whole point.
On the redistribution point, almost everyone will have their own idea of what different jobs are worth, right? So you might say, it's shocking that a nurse who's got this immediate hands-on role helping people is not as well paid as a financier, right? I might say, it's shocking that a Sunday Telegraph columnist isn't as well paid as a Premier League footballer, right? Julia might say it's appalling that a hedgie gets more than a radio presenter. We will all have our own ideas. And the magic of the market is that it arbitrates those competing ideas by, instead of saying, what in the abstract do you think somebody is worth, by asking the question, what are you prepared to contribute of your own to get the service? How many hours of yours are you prepared to put in to buy the haircut, or to buy the paper and read the Columnist, or whatever it is, right? And by the way, the guy optimizing the allocation of capital is paid on the basis of the utility of that service. If he stops producing, he doesn't get paid, right? That's a better system, a fairer system, than one where people in charge can use favoritism and nepotism to lay down what they think is fair. I'm not saying it's a perfect system, I'm just saying it is better than all the alternatives. Very briefly, on the environment. The best thing to happen to our environment was the fall of the Berlin Wall. A conservative, as the etymology implies, is a conservationist. We care about the Burkean ideal of preserving things for the next generation. It was Marx who taught that the environment was a resource to be exploited. A doctrine that found brutal realization in the smokestack industries of the Eastern Bloc. Soviet communism turned the Volga into a sewer and turned the Black Sea into a oil slick so severe that ferry passengers had to be told not to throw cigarettes off their boat. Why? Because the old Aristotelian wisdom applies: that which nobody owns, no one will care for. When everything is communal, no one has an incentive to look after it. And therefore, the best thing you can do to raise environmental standards in a country is to make it wealthier through market mechanisms, so that you get to the point where people can shoot things with cameras rather than with guns, because they value and they have the luxury of being able to value the world around them. Final statistic. Wolves, lions, and tigers were all endangered. Bears because, oh my. Wolves, lions, and tigers. Now, what has happened in the last 50 years? Wolves have recovered, tigers have flatlined, lions are still endangered. Why? Because wolves live in rich countries, tigers live in middle-income countries, lions live in poor countries. The best thing that you can do to preserve your environment is to raise the living standard of the people.
Are you having an out-of-body experience?
I actually do agree with Dawn about. I also a waitress for many, many years, and I know when I was a waitress doing double shifts, 14 hours a day, I worked a darn sight harder than I do doing a 3.5-hour radio show. But of course, this idea that everyone should be paid the same, because that is what socialism is about, is it does ignore the fact that an awful lot of people can do some of those lower paid jobs, and not that many people can do other jobs. And I make this point on my radio show all the time. We can all sit and say, these chief executives don't have any particular value, what do they do? These footballers, why they should be paid this much, this movie actor. If it's that easy, let's all go and bloody do it. Because I'd be really happy to be paid £1 million to do a job that apparently is so easy that any of us can do it, and we can't. I do think, though, it is worth discussing. I know you were making a facetious point, and now you're thinking, why did I do that at the front row? But it is absolutely fascinating how this debate about socialism has moved on to a debate about climate change and a debate about overpopulation, and this idea that human beings are somehow bad just by existing. And you've got people like Prince Harry and Meghan talking about, we're only going to have 2 children. It's so bad for the world. This is an absolute load of complete claptrap nonsense. We've had this since Thomas Malthus onwards. This is simply an absolute load of nonsense that the world cannot cope with 7 billion people at the time. I only had 1 billion or so, and somehow we are miraculously feeding more people. More people are living happier, healthier, longer, more productive, worthwhile lives than ever before. And that is down to 2 things: the Industrial Revolution and capitalism. And it is as simple as that. So this idea that the arguments about climate change, again, climate crisis, there isn't one. Overpopulation crisis, there isn't one. This is all complete nonsense. But it is actually being used right now as an argument to change our capitalist systems, to change the free market, to undermine the big business that's so awful. By the way, businesses only get big if they sell things we want to buy. So it is actually a very, very, very dangerous message that is now completely mainstream in our media, completely mainstream on the BBC and on Sky News. Not on my bloody show, it isn't. But this is tune in, talk radio, 6:30 to 10 every morning. But it genuinely is a concern of mine.
Alternatives exist.
Not this morning they did,
No,
and
they
you were off
didn't.
air.
No, you're right.
How we laughed. But it is very insidious, this idea that saving the climate is going to have to require moving away from capitalism. And I agree with Daniel that capitalism is actually the route to actually improving our world, improving people's lot, improving the environment. And we mustn't give in to that. And you must, every single person in this room has to fight that every single day, because that agenda is now completely solid there on the media and political agenda. We've got it in the government's own priorities, not even just the Green parties and the Corbyn Labour Party. And that's something that absolutely needs to be fought every day, because that is actually a fight against free market capitalism, which is what I think most people in here would support.
The The great thing about this debate so far is that it's going to make Dawn very much more productive than she already is, because it's given her at least 10 new columns to write. I'm going to actually go to the audience before I come back to the two of you, if that's all right. Lady at the front there, then the gentleman there.
I'd like to ask Dawn, what happens when the wealth has been distributed, the ones that have been to the bookies haven't got anything left, then you've got the steady ones in the middle, and then you've got the ones that are going to make more. At what point are you going to redistribute it again?
Okay. No, we're two.
Hi, Andrew Lipsey from Broadland constituency. I think, Ian, you've got a place there, is that right?
I do.
Yes, indeed.
I'm a wicked second home.
You are wicked.
Yes.
Capitalist. No, I won't say the next word. Listen, I've been lucky enough to have 5 children go through school, university, and now left university. And socialism in the young people is created by teachers indoctrinating and lecturers indoctrinating my kids day in, day out. And this term at school, in secondary school, my daughter is being indoctrinated by the economics and sociology teachers. They are basically saying Boris is a horrible person and we shouldn't be supporting leaving the EU and all this. Socialism is the main thing, though. They ram it down their throats all day long.
Okay. Here, and then lady at the back.
Andy Watts from Wokingham. Mine is a two-part question. If we're really honest with ourselves, then some, not all, of what Dawn said is actually true. So my two-part question is, for this half of the panel, what should we do differently to resolve some of those issues? And for Dawn, were we able to do that, would you join the Conservative Party?
I'm actually from South Africa, one of the most unequal societies in the world. Our Gini coefficient is ridiculous. But the more we redistribute, the more poverty and inequality we have. And the policies of our government, which is not my party, by the way, we're a sister party to the Conservative Party, and thank you for having us. The more we redistribute, the worse the Gini coefficient becomes, and the more poverty there is, and the less businesses want to invest, and the more we socialize our economy, the worse it becomes. Our joblessness is 75% for young people. So it's a lesson to other people. We're not yet Venezuela, but we're getting there. And it's a lesson to people in wealthy countries. Don't do it. Don't do it.
Right, let's go to the panel. Scott? Give the mic.
Yes, you sort of stole my thunder a bit. Dan, before with the Berlin Wall, you see, the Berlin Wall wasn't there to keep people out; it was there to keep. Oh, is that better? Yeah, the Berlin Wall wasn't there to keep people out; it was to keep people in. And time and time again, it's the same thing around the world. In South Africa at the moment, in Venezuela, the more you socialise, the more people try to leave, and they. It goes back to what Dawn was saying as well with wages. If everyone got paid the same, I don't think there'd be many people out there, doing the hard work jobs. They'd be there. Oh, everyone's going to be going for the easy, cushy jobs, because if you're going to get paid the same wage, it either comes down to ability, as Julie was saying before. Like, there's jobs that people can't do, and there's jobs that people won't do. And if you don't have that cash incentive, like in previous roles, I've worked in mining and stuff like that in pretty bad conditions, and the wages are good, but then that's why they're good. Like, that's how I can't see how equalising the wage for everyone is a solution to that. Yeah.
Okay, Christian.
Well, the idea that climate change is caused by capitalism or greedy corporations is just silly. I mean, corporations do not emit CO2 in order to wind up Guardian columnists. They do it because it's an unfortunate byproduct of producing useful goods and services that people are prepared to buy. Now, what would happen if you nationalized, say, British Airways? What would happen to their carbon footprint the day after? Nothing. It would still be exactly the same because the production technology, the motors would still be exactly the same. This is a trade-off that you have under any economic system, whether it's capitalism, socialism, a mixed economy, anything. There is a trade-off between environmental conservation and living standards. Got nothing to do with what system you live under. But where I think Dawn has a point is on the British housing crisis and on the American healthcare system. However, how do we know that Britain has a healthcare housing crisis, and how do we know that America has a terrible healthcare system? Well, it's because we compare those sectors in those countries to sectors incomparable, to the same sector in comparable countries. We compare house prices in Britain to house prices in continental Europe. We compare healthcare coverage in the US to healthcare coverage in other developed countries, and that's how we know that those countries are doing something wrong. And that shows you that this is nothing inherent in capitalism, because if it were, you would see the same thing everywhere. Why don't other countries have no housing crisis? It's not that they only have state building, it's that they have more liberal systems of land use planning. Japan has no housing crisis, even though the city of Tokyo has been growing massively, about the same as the city of London. It's just that Tokyo builds more houses than the whole of England every year, and that's why they don't have a housing crisis. As for American healthcare, well, we have plenty of systems that offer universal access to healthcare, some of them very market-based. You don't get state-run hospitals in the Netherlands. You get a relatively market-based health insurance system in Switzerland. Nonetheless, they cover everybody, no medical bankruptcies. These are issues that can absolutely be addressed within a market economy.
I'm trying to remember all the questions now.
Don't ask me.
The redistribution, once you've done it once, what happens the second time?
I don't think anybody is arguing that under a socialist government everybody would be paid the same. And so I think that some people are paid a huge amount of money and they would pay more tax, and that would go to the lowest earners. And I think that under a socialist government, people would want people to be paid a living wage. And the current Conservative claimed living wage isn't enough to live on. And also under the Conservatives, housing benefit has been cut, the local housing allowance has been cut, and that often doesn't meet the costs of renting. So I don't think anybody's arguing that everybody should be paid the same. I think that all me and everybody I know is arguing is that some people earn a huge amount of money and aren't paying as much tax as they possibly could do, and a lot of people are earning poverty wages, working their asses off, and could be paid a little bit more just so that they can feed their kids and be a lot happier.
What about the lady from South Africa, her question, which the South African government is, to all intents and purposes, a socialist government, yet it's one of the most unequal countries in the world?
I think this will always happen. I don't know very much about South Africa. I don't know very much about South Africa, but I do know that living in the UK, we have this horrific housing crisis, which is caused by capitalism, and the US have a horrific healthcare crisis, which is caused by capitalism. And if you want to know why Bernie Sanders is so popular, then just look at capitalism.
Right, lady there in the middle, and then someone over this side, gentleman here.
This is a question not for Dawn. So the rest of the panel has talked about how terrible everything was under Labour in the 70s, but since then we've had basically sort of 20, 30 years of free market neoliberal economics, including under Tony Blair's Labour, and we're currently in one of the biggest housing crises we've ever seen. We've got a huge homelessness crisis. We're in the first generation of people that are due to earn less than their parents. So after 30 years of that, what makes you so sure that you're right?
Are you from Rory Stewart's constituency? Right, gentleman here.
Alan Rankin, councillor in Bletchley Park. At the start, Don, you mentioned that there's too many wealthy people owning too many properties. does that make John McDonnell a hypocrite?
Right, actually, let's go to the panel. Julia, do you want to address the point from the lady there?
Yeah, I'm interested by your use of the word crisis. Everything's a crisis now, isn't it? We don't have an NHS crisis. I've got a very ageing relative right now in hospital, in an NHS hospital in Lewisham, and we don't have...
That is not evidence.
Yeah, sorry.
That's not evidence, Julia. That's an anecdote.
Okay. What about life expectancy?
Okay.
Would that be
Yeah,
evidence?
could I finish? Yeah. Life expectancy isn't falling. No, it is not falling. It's this use of the word crisis about everything that's going a bit wrong. I think the point that you made about the housing, if capitalism led to housing crises and millions and millions of people unable to buy homes, things, then that, as you say, would be happening everywhere around the world. There are lots of things that are wrong in this country. I was raised in a Labour household. I was raised by a guy who stood to be a Labour MP. I went to school in 1979 in the May election day wearing a T-shirt saying "Win with Jim." So got sent home, obviously. But even in those days. But the thing is, I think the idea that it's this very simplistic way that we argue now that if something isn't quite right in this particular area, then it must be the fault of capitalism, whatever. Whereas actually, if you look at, say, the issue of housing, this is entirely a supply-side issue in terms of the planning rules. There's no question at all. That's exactly what it is. There is nothing else about it. There is nothing about welfare capitalism or social democracy that in any way creates that, unless governments are deliberately creating it, and it's NIMBYism.
Dan? Yeah.
So, has life deteriorated over the last 30 years, right? Now, let's just actually think back to how we lived 30 years ago, those of you who are old enough to remember, which will be no one on the panel except maybe Ian and me. 30 years ago. Right, well then let me explain it to you, Dawn, because I can remember what it was like. Most obviously, there was no wiki, there was no Wi-Fi, there were no cheap flights, right? There was no EasyJet. Travel was a big deal. Telephoning was a big deal, right? It was an expensive, serious, especially to make an international call. You went on holiday, you needed a big thing called a camera, and then you had to go and get a roll of film developed, right? There was the increases that we have in terms of our availability of diet, in terms of availability of entertainment. There were 3 channels on TV. There wasn't even a Blockbuster Video in those days, right? The idea that we were better off 30 years ago. I would love the people who make that argument to travel back in a time machine for just a week and then come back and tell me that nothing has got any better. Now, the only exception, which you correctly say, is housing. Guess what? It's the one bit that is totally regulated by the government. In a generally market system, it's the bit that is still controlled by the state. So it is literally the exception that proves the rule, and it very neatly demonstrates that the best way to get ahead is to get the government out of the way.
Dawn. We're being offered some red wine as well. Right?
How to follow that? I mean, I think the main reason that socialism is so popular now amongst young people is that we lived through the financial crisis, and I'm sure everybody here agrees that the financial crisis of 2008, when I was at university, was caused by socialism. Is that right?
By excessive regulation.
And apparently it's because capitalism wasn't capitalist enough.
Yep. In a capitalist system, the bad banks would have been closed down and there would have been no bailout.
Apparently the banks are too socialist. You heard it here first. But yeah, I mean, the reason why so many young people are interested in socialism is because we can't afford houses, and it isn't because we can't build in the green belt. It's basically because basically Margaret Thatcher sold off absolutely yeah. So Margaret Thatcher sold off a huge number of council houses at cut rates, and now 45% of them are rented out by private landlords. And people who live in them, like me, I live in an ex-council flat, can't afford to save up and buy a home. I mean, so my parents earned a lot less than I do now, and they were able to buy their own home. And I can't do it. And, it's basically this massive generational gap that has caused so many people to look at capitalism and say, It's just not working. It just simply isn't. Where do I live? So
we want the exact address.
You'll love this. So I live in Clapham. And I have extraordinarily cheap rent because my landlord is a very, very guilty Corbynite. And even then,
So you can save for a deposit?
No, I can't because I still can't.
What does the Guardian pay you, Dawn?
Fuck all.
Right, we have to move on, and we have closing statements now from each panellist. Scott, would you like to start, please? Maximum of a minute, but if you want to do it under a minute, we would be grateful.
Yes, it's kind of ironic that getting cheap rent through capitalism, but it's yes, I agree. But there's the argument, like I see a lot of young people now saying, I can't afford to buy a house. You don't really see making the argument in, say, the travel sector or in technology, where they say, like, everyone can go on a cheap flight these days. There's so many more things available because of the market, because of capitalism. And as has been identified there, it's only one sector of the economy that's causing problems, and it's because of the government intervention and the tight regulations of building and the ability to build that's causing the problems, rather than capitalism itself. But as Dan was making the point before, there's so many more things that have gotten better through capitalism than have gotten worse. Well, yeah.
I should remind you, you're fighting to stay in the balloon.
Have we done? Yeah, it's not the right to buy that caused the housing crisis. We still have a very high proportion of social housing in Britain. About 1 in 5 housing units are still in social housing. That's one of the highest proportions in Europe. It's just that the right to buy program was big because we started from an extremely high level. In the early 80s, 1 in 3 housing units were owned by the state. Of course, if you have such a starting point, then you can sell off a lot and still be left with a lot. But on the whole, we still have a lot of social housing, about the same as Sweden and Denmark, more than most of the rest of Europe. The big difference really is in the planning laws, and that's quite a well-studied issue. That there's lots of economists who have looked at this, not necessarily free market economists, but you can compare housing markets around the world, and you'll find that it's always Britain that is the outlier, or places that have a planning system that is similar to the British one, such as California in the US, but you don't get a housing crisis in, say, Texas, where you can build almost wherever you like. It's the one sector of our economy that is closest to socialism, and it's also the most dysfunctional sector. Go figure.
Okay.
As I said in my earlier opening remarks, for me it's all about, the proof is in the pudding. One of the latest things everyone's been trying in Scandinavian countries, and the push to try it here, is this sort of universal basic income. And in the first experiment, they discovered that an awful lot of people who were given a basic income for doing bugger all did bugger all. I mean, imagine everyone's surprise. Who knew? It is simply the case that, and it's like the last general election when the very, very surprising vote, I think, for most of us, I think not least for Jeremy Corbyn, that he got 40% of the vote, is that actually people say, oh, well, people are voting for socialism. Well, yes, people were voting for taxes to go up for the top 5%. 95% of people, by definition, not in the top 5%. Everyone's really keen on redistributing wealth until it's their wealth. And the reality is, eventually, as the pie of wealth diminishes, as it inevitably does under socialism, it's going to be your piece of pie that gets cut as well. And funnily enough, people are less keen on that.
I thought the most telling moment in the debate was when the lady from South Africa said, we have a socialist government and rising inequality. And Dawn said, well, that always happens. Spot on. That always happens, right? Because there is this huge gap between the intentions and the outcomes. One of the things that always astonishes me is the Corbynist elevation of Singapore into this terrible Dickensian bogeyman. On any metric, you would rather be poor or elderly or ill in Singapore than in the UK. Their life expectancy is better, their healthcare system is better, their employment, they're likely to be in work and earning on almost any metric, but that doesn't matter because as long as they do these things through low taxes, it somehow devalues the whole system. So I would just ask, everyone who is still pining for this imaginary socialism to give me one example of something that approximates it, because the world has given us some proper laboratory quality experiments. You can compare North Korea to South Korea. You can compare East Germany to West Germany. They were starting from the same place. Would you rather be poor in North Korea or in South Korea? Would you rather be a grungy, anti-government Guardianista type in East Germany or in West Germany? If you are interested in practical outcomes, then the market system has created the best place ever in history to be female or poor or from an ethnic minority or a religious minority or in any other vulnerable group. And if that doesn't matter to you because you've got an objection to it in theory, you need to ask yourself some tough questions.
Ladies and gentlemen, before Dawn speaks, I'm afraid I have to go because apparently the Tories have got a private event on in the exhibition hall, which means I can't broadcast my programme from there tonight, which begins at 7. So we have to go to our Manchester studio. So Julia can take over the chairmanship of this event. I'm very sorry, it's very rude of me, but it's how I earn my living. So apologies.
Big round of applause for Ian. Come on. Woo, woo, woo. Yeah, fuck Eddie Mayer. Anyway, I love Eddie Mayer as well, but Dawn, I think you should have a good 5 minutes now, love.
Thank you. This is the first time I've sat next to somebody who's lied about what I've said. I didn't.
You did say that.
I didn't say. I didn't say it always happens under socialism. No, it's absolutely bullshit. It's absolutely bullshit. No, So what I said was I didn't know about South Africa, and then I talked about something else. So to close, so for me, socialism is about fairness. For everybody I know, socialism is about fairness, and it's about making sure that people who are extraordinarily vulnerable are less vulnerable, and that people who earn poverty wages no longer earn poverty wages and can actually feed their children. And if you want to, if you really want to think about, like, what is a socialist project, the NHS is the best one. I have very, very severe epilepsy. I'm in hospital a lot, and over again, I speak to my friends who have epilepsy in America, and I can't believe the hoops they have to jump through, the absolute, like, how much money they have to spend on being alive and staying alive, whereas I know that every single time I am rushed to hospital in an ambulance, I don't pay a penny, apart from my tax. And I think that, the NHS is a massive socialist project, and I can't imagine anybody here actually disagrees with it and would prefer a privatised health system. And okay, that's weird. Well, I'm sure you're very healthy. I'm sure if you actually had, like, a very severe health condition, you would understand. The American health system is a big pile of shit. I'm sorry, it is.
No, but that's the whole point. Is that everyone's saying most of the health systems in the EU are actually, they have better outcomes and they're privatised systems.
I mean, so the NHS are brilliant, but also, like, Scandinavia is very, very good. Scandinavian education is fantastic, and if you look at Scandinavia, they have fantastic outcomes. Whereas if you look at the UK, in the last 5 years, actually, life expectancy has declined for a huge number of people. It actually has. It has.
There are predictions.
No, it has. I've spoken to a huge number of academics. So anyway, you all hate me and I don't care.
No, we don't. No.
You all hate me and I don't care. But it's fine because you're all getting nationalised.
Can I just say, I think a massive round of applause. This view is like me walking into the BBC. You get a lot of. She still blocks me on Twitter, but you get a lot of credit for turning up and arguing a point, and I give you all credit. I don't give a shit. Anyway, So am I allowed to swear here? Right. Apparently it falls to me to start the voting. Let's be generous now, people. Let's be generous. I think we all know who's won. Right. Okay, so can we have a big cheer if you want to save Scott Simmons? Big cheer if you want to save Christian Nimitz. I took my cardigan off and everything. Mainly because I'm a woman of a certain age and I don't know whether it's hot in here or I'm having a hot flush. I have no idea. But at least your lot will give me some time off bloody work for it. So, a big cheer for me. A undoubtedly bigger cheer for Dan Hannan. And a cheer for Don Foster. Don. Can I say Don? Okay, I think we can safely say the winner is, take a stand, Mr. Daniel Hannan.
Thank you very much, guys, and I wish this were only a theoretical debate, but in a few weeks' time it's going to become a very real one.
Thank you very, very much for coming. Enjoy yourself.